that both of us have spoken quite passionately, I suppose, against changing the law. But I think we need to be fair that the case for changing the law is not entirely without merit. Neither Ilora or I are absolutists in this. I speak for myself, and I'm pretty sure I speak for you on this one. That, you know, there is a problem here. We're living longer than we were before. My grandfather died at 67. I remember the phrase, I was a little boy, good innings. Well, that was the phrase, good innings. I think I'd feel shortchanged now if I died at 67. And, you know, we're living longer, but we're not necessarily living healthier. We're becoming more susceptible to long-lasting degenerative illnesses. People are also lonelier. Families are splitting up. Even where they don't split up, if your children live near you, very often both of them are having to work in order to support a family. They're not in a position to look after you. It's not surprising, therefore, that there are pressures in a changed society growing for this. And I think as a society, we're going to have to find answers to this. My point is that I don't think it's too simplistic an answer. But the case is not without merit, and I do believe the proponents of the law when they say that compassion is their motive. I think they're perfectly honourable people, and this is not a good versus evil contest. And I think we need to remember that. First of all, it's my life. I want to decide when I die. You can decide when you die. What you can't decide by law is to involve somebody else in bringing about your death. Now, if the law in New Zealand were such, and the law in New Zealand on this is almost identical with the law in England and Wales, actually. If the law in New Zealand was such that it was constantly hauling people through the courts for bringing about the deaths of other people and sending them to prison, there may be something wrong, but it isn't. That's not what happens. The law is there for all of us. It's not there for individuals, for certain strong-minded individuals. The purpose of the law is not to give us options and choices for living. The purpose of the criminal law is to provide safety, is to provide protection for society, and especially for its most vulnerable members from harm. And that includes self-harm. Remember all these suicide prevention policies that we've got? Remember all the suicide watches that we've got? The law actually reflects a very valuable social message. Society's view of suicide is interesting. We treat people who attempt suicide with understanding and compassion, quite rightly. But suicide itself is not something to be encouraged or assisted. The society's view of this is very clear, and the law actually reflects it. Now, you know, when you change the law, you change the dynamic. Because at the moment, anyone who is inclined to assist someone's suicide has to think very carefully indeed about the consequences before they do that. And the result of that means that the number of cases is very small, and it tends to be those where there has been genuinely compassionate motivation, serious soul-searching, great reluctance. Those are the sort of cases that don't need to be prosecuted, and they aren't prosecuted. It's been described in England as a law with a stern face but an understanding heart. Now, you know, we can't have autonomy in a complete autonomy in a society. The only place you can have autonomy is if you live on a desert island. We cannot simply say, I want to behave how I want to behave. It sounds responsibly libertarian to say, let me do what I want provided I don't harm anybody else. But who's to make those judgments? It can't be left to the person taking the action who has the vested interest in the outcome. Every day we see people act thoughtlessly or maliciously without regard to the values of others. We can't leave autonomous decisions simply to individuals. We have to have laws to protect society as a whole.
We have to remember we are interrelated in a society. What one person does has a knock-on effect to other people, and no one is an island. We are not islands. What we do affects those around, and the law has to be there to protect the majority. That's what laws are there for. Well, there is absolutely nothing in life that has a 100% chance of success. There is no medical treatment that has a 100% chance of success. And anyway, palliative care isn't like a course of antibiotics. It isn't like if you've got a urinary tract infection, you get given trimethoprim, it either works or it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, then you'll go on to a different antibiotic. It's not like that. It's about a whole person approach to care, which is attention, meticulous attention to detail in all the domains of your life and those important to you, who are usually your family, but not always. That might even be involved looking after pets that are precious or whatever. But it's a whole person approach. And anyway, the person's circumstances are changing, and what they need today, they may need something different tomorrow, and that flexibility and review is built into the process.
Well, it's certainly, in terms of its catchment area, it's much wider than Oregon. In fact, it's much closer to Holland. In terms of the safeguards, there are actually very few of them. I mean, a key safeguard is the one about mental capacity. I don't think anyone would dispute the fact that if you're to give assistance with suicide or euthanasia to someone, they must be okay up here. They must know exactly what they're doing, and they must be free from impaired judgment. There is no provision for that in the bill. It simply says you need to know what assisted suicide is and what will be the result. Well, it is screaming the obvious, isn't it, when you think about it? I mean, it will be very hard to find somebody who didn't understand that. There is no requirement for mental competence at all. But more widely than that, what you have got in this bill, and not just in this bill, but in Oregon's law and in Dutch law, is a series of general statements that somebody must know what they're doing. They must be free from pressure. But there's no minimum action required on a doctor to take to ensure that these safeguards are met. Now, we pointed this out in the UK and got a rather curious answer. And the answer was, oh, don't worry, there'll be codes of practice drawn up after you've approved a change in the law. Now, you know, this is asking Parliament to sign a blank cheque. Basically, it's saying, sign here to change the law to legalise assisted suicide or euthanasia, and then we'll decide what the terms are afterwards. You know, and when you question that, you're told, oh no, these are just details. No, they're not details. If you are to set the parameters for this, you need to show Parliament precisely what the parameters are, and it needs to take an informed decision on that basis.
I would completely agree, and from a medical point of view, this bill is asking doctors to state in law things which they cannot state with any certainty. They cannot state somebody has a life expectancy of less than 6 months. These things such as capability, what on earth is meant by the term capability? What about people who've got learning difficulties? What about people who've got MS? What about people who, for example, are on steroids for whatever reason? I don't mean gym-type steroids, I mean not the steroids medically. We know that actually they can be very emotionally labile whilst they're on the medication. It's a side effect of it, it's often under-recognised. They can feel quite black moods quite suddenly, they can feel suicidal, and when you take the dose right down or take them off it, they're restored to a completely different mental state, and it's often missed. The question is, would you if you were faced with it? I was faced with it. My mother was in a hospice with a life expectancy of about 2 weeks. The medical director, who I'd known for many years, took me aside and said, Ilora, I think your mum really is dying now. How are you going to cope? She did not want to be a burden. She was fiercely independent, and she wanted assisted suicide. And she was extremely angry with me because at the time I was opposing Lord Joffrey's bill. And she really harangued me over it, and it was awful. And a couple of nights I was just in floods of tears, and my lovely nephew came and put his arms around me. And I thought, what am I doing? You know, I am denying my own mother what she wants. Anyway, she couldn't have it. And after she had an argument with the chaplain in the hospice, actually, and he was quite good because he went back next day and said it was an interesting conversation, she began to realise that even though her body was crook, actually her mind worked fine. And she decided she was determined to be independent again. If she couldn't have what she wanted as assisted suicide, she then went home, lived at home independently, entertaining her friends, coming in, going to the shops. She had to have somebody drive her because she couldn't drive anymore. But she lived for 4 years. In that time, she saw her 2 great-grandsons born, and she said they were the best 4 years of her life. And she was glad that she couldn't have ended it when she wanted to, because she would have never had all those precious moments, and we would have missed out. So whoever asked that, yeah, I've been there. And it's not easy, and it's turmoil, but I was glad that nobody could give my mother a lethal overdose, because you just never know what lies ahead.
I'm going to split the question into 2, if I may. Would my opinion on it shift? I don't know, probably not. Would I do it? Quite possibly. None of us can ever say whether we will break the law in exceptional circumstances. But that's not a reason to set up a licensing system to do it. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples. Imagine a parent rushing a desperately sick child to hospital. He'd probably break the speed limit. Imagine a mother of children whose family are starving and she has no money. She might well steal. Imagine what would happen if you got up in the night and found an intruder who threatened your family. You might well injure him in order to protect your family. But would you actually license assault, dangerous driving, theft in advance in prescribed circumstances? If, you know, I could, if my wife were dying in great pain, and she was begging me to assist her to die, would I do it? I honestly don't know, and I hope I would never be placed in that situation. And I'm sure every one of you would take that line. I cannot say whether I would do it, but what I can say, what I would not want is a licensing system. Let me very quickly tell you here something called the policeman's dilemma. I don't know whether you've heard of this. The select committee, I saw once, well, you obviously heard of it, so the select committee had this question posed to every witness, scores of witnesses. On a lonely interstate highway in the United States, a petrol tanker overturned and the driver was trapped in the cab. Petrol was leaking onto the engine block. First on the scene was a highway patrolman. He could see what was happening. The tanker was going to go up at any moment. The driver could see it. He said, "For God's sake, shoot me. I don't want to burn to death." And the policeman shot him. And the questions was asked to every witness, was he right to do that? It was a "have you stopped beating your wife yet" type question. If you said yes, he was right to shoot him, you said, well, in that case, you're in favour of voluntary euthanasia, aren't you? If you said no, you said, oh, in that case, you're heartless. You couldn't get it right. And none of the witnesses could see a way out of this. And then one of them, oddly enough, it was a man who was wearing a clerical collar, which made it even more ironic. He said, yes, he did the right thing, and I hope you would too. And you could feel the ripple in the public gallery of surprise. But he said, I wouldn't change the law to make that legal. And I remember sitting there thinking, yeah, I think that's the answer to the question. That, you know, laws are made for every day. They are not made for exceptional circumstances, but they also contain discretion to deal sensibly with exceptional circumstances. Prosecution does not follow automatically from illegality. You have to display criminality first. I hope that answers the question. Well, we've had a certain amount of experience for referenda in the UK of late. I don't know whether you've heard about it.
And it was a bit simpler than this question.
It was, the problem with referenda, actually, is that they invite yes or no answers to very complex questions. I'm not sure there is a yes or no answer to this question. Now, you know, it may appear that because I've been speaking against changing the law, I'm an absolutist. I'm not. I can actually see a case possibly for this to happen in certain circumstances, but that's not the question. The question is, should you set up a licensing system for it? Now, I'm actually straying away from the question here. Should there be a referendum? It's linked to the issue of opinion polling, isn't it? I mean, opinion polling, we're told, opinion polling is a means of testing public opinion, as is a referendum. Opinion polling, we're told, says 75% of people want to see a law changed. But opinion polls depend on the way questions are phrased, the way they are sequenced. They also depend on what knowledge respondents have of the subject. And this links us to referenda again. Most of us lead busy lives. We have only got the time and the patience to know about perhaps 3 or 4 subjects really well that are of immediate relevance to us. Whether we care to admit it or not, for most of the things we have views on, we depend on what we read in the press or hear on the radio or see on television. And those things tend to be the exceptional ones, that somebody who is making a particular case for a change in the law. The press reports the exceptional. It doesn't do it out of malice, it just needs to sell papers. And I'm afraid what happens every day to most people doesn't sell papers. I mean, look, let me give you an example. When was the last time you heard that flight NZ415 landed safely at Auckland? You won't hear it because it happens every night. And that is the problem, that, you know, levels of information, levels of analysis on this are not high. And I'm sorry if that sounds anti-democratic, but this is a very important decision. It is a life or death issue for large numbers of people. And simply to put it before them on a yes or no basis, say that or that, just doesn't work, I'm afraid.
I'm afraid I have to say, I think it's almost got nothing to do with it. You can have beliefs one way or another. Are you going to say that because somebody has a religious belief or doesn't have a religious belief that the value of their opinion is greater or less, and it's only a belief? What I would say is just look at the evidence, look at what words say written on paper, look what laws state, and people can have their beliefs. They can be humanists, they can be Christian, they can be Jewish, they can be Buddhist, they can be nothing. They'll all have their opinions, and that's fine. But what we're talking about is the law written down in black and white and how that law is interpreted and used.
First of all, can I deal with the statement that about being forced to stay alive? No one who is seriously ill is forced to stay alive, as Ilora has just explained. It is within your rights as a patient to refuse treatment. Refusing treatment, life-sustaining treatment, is in neither law nor medical ethics constitutes suicide. And if you refuse treatment, you will not be abandoned, you will be looked after by your doctors. There is a medical obligation on there. First, and then we go on to talk about harm. The do no harm principle is a medical ethical principle. In fact, not all medical schools administer the Hippocratic Oath, but the principles of medical ethics are basically the same. And it's this question of doctor-patient trust which is at the heart of this. If we are to trust our doctors, and we have to trust our doctors, like we trust our airline pilots. You know, when I get on a plane and I sit at the end of the runway at Auckland, I don't say, do I trust the pilot? Of course I trust him. He's the best pilot in the world. He's my pilot. I have no choice. And you know, I hope these are not famous last words. But you know, you have to trust, because you know, we have to trust our doctors because we need medical care and they've been cleared to treat us. But if we're to trust them, they must act in our best interest. We must be quite sure that they will always act in our best interest and that they will not do harm to us. Now, you know, if you feel I would like to die, but the law doesn't allow me to die, that does not mean the doctor is doing harm to you. The doctor has to abide by certain medical ethical principles if you are to be protected.
The problem for the person who's ill is something has happened to them that they never wanted to happen. So the harm is the illness that's happened to them. The role of the healthcare services is to do everything to mitigate against that, to look at all the things that might happen and put in place in advance strategies of how you would deal with it if this happened, if that happened, if the other happened. The patients who I have looked after who have been really frightened of what lies ahead have almost always been frightened of something that actually isn't going to happen to them anyway. And even if it's something that they're at risk of, they've needed to have the reassurance of knowing what we would do about it. Now, if you take somebody, for example, with lung cancer, and they're frightened of becoming breathless, many patients have the view that somehow they'll suddenly stop breathing and suffocate. That actually won't happen. So when you explain to them, that's not going to happen to you, but if you feel breathless, this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to give you some morphine, and if you feel really breathless you can take a little bit more, and here's an inhaler, and you've got some standby oxygen, and here's a number to phone if you feel desperate. And you make sure that you've got services that will be there when people need them, then actually you're not leaving people and sentencing them to endure harm. You're saying, these are the things that might happen, and we're putting preventive measures in place every step of the way to deal with whatever the eventuality might be. At the end of the day, people have got to know that they can phone somebody 7 days a week, because disease does not respect the clock or the calendar. They have to know who they can phone, when they can phone. Patients over many years have had my home phone number and my mobile phone number. It's never been abused. But just occasionally people have phoned me because something's happened suddenly and we've got it sorted out in a short time.
If you change any law like this and you make a law permissive, there is going to be a rise in numbers. I mean, that's predictable. The question is, how long does that go on? I remember doing a debate in the UK, a couple of years ago, against the deputy chair of the local voluntary euthanasia organisation. And he said, if you look at the graph of Oregon, it went up at first and it's levelled off. And I couldn't help remarking, I think you've got the graph upside down. That the graph actually went up fairly slowly at first. And when I went to Oregon in 2004, it looked pretty benign. But since then, it's gone like that. And it's showing no sign of coming down. And the same is true of the Netherlands. I think what is happening here is a change in the dynamic. Laws are not just regulatory instruments. Laws send social messages. When a law is made, people assume that Parliament approves of the action concerned. That may not be the case. You know, that an assisted dying law sends the message, and it may be a totally unintended message, that if you're seriously ill, taking your own life is something that it's appropriate to consider. Now, that may not have been the intention. And the dynamic changes. And one Dutch ethicist who used to be a member of one of the review committees wrote recently, he said, in the Netherlands, euthanasia is on the way to becoming the default mode of dying for cancer patients. It's quite a stunning statement. And, you know, the fact that 1 in 26 of all deaths is now from euthanasia. There. I think what is happening is not simply take up of a new law. That should have tailed off by now. And in fact, in the Netherlands, if you look at the graph, the first 5 years it was level. And the proponents of euthanasia said, there you are, you see, there's no slippery slope. And suddenly the graph went like that. It's not take up a new law, it's a change in the social dynamic.
I think you also have to look at the attempt, there is an attempt at the moment to expand the law in Oregon to move on from physician-assisted suicide to euthanasia. Belgium has now legalised euthanasia for children. And if you look at the Belgian cases, there have been cases which, well, actually they would have fitted, I guess, because I don't really understand the criteria. There was a man who was euthanized because he was distressed after a botched sex change operation. There were twins who were going blind, who felt they couldn't live without each other, so they were given euthanasia together. There are quite a few cases of young people, and then the stories of depression. And then we don't know about the ones that aren't reported as well. There's no way of detecting those. Okay, the worst suffering I have ever come across, I think, were the parents of a child who'd been murdered. And they lived every waking minute with their guilt that they'd let their only child get into the situation where she could be abused and murdered. And that, I honestly think, was their suffering was absolutely intolerable every minute of every day. That's a completely different type of suffering to suffering from illness. Suffering is, I'm afraid, part of the human condition. But how do we as a society respond? We've had people who've committed suicide after terrible bereavements. We had a woman who jumped off Beachy Head with her dead child's body not that long ago because she felt she couldn't live without her child. But what do we do as a society? We try to support people through and look after them, not say, yes, you're suffering and we'll leave you in isolation and we'll help you finish yourself off.
I mean, when the Select Committee went to Oregon, it was told the people who go for this are people who have been in control all their lives, who don't want to be dependent on anyone else, and don't want other people to be dependent on them as well. They cannot bear the thought of loss of function. Now, I completely respect that. I would feel exactly the same. Somebody once asked me in a debate, would you want this for yourself? And my answer was quite possibly. That's not a reason to change the law. And there's all kinds of things I want for myself, but I wouldn't legalise them. And no, I didn't mean that. But you know, the problem is that assisted dying is being marketed on different grounds. That there is a subtle message that unless we have it, people will die in agony. I mean, in fact, as you quite rightly say, the suffering tends to be existential. It's the feeling. Another witness put it, it's not the symptoms of dying that's the problem, it's the fact of dying. You know, should we be changing the law for this? I mean, I can, if people were dying in agony, I could understand it. But that is one of the things which actually modern specialist palliative care can deal with. But it's being sold on one basis, but the reality is rather different. I think I'm talking off the top of my head now, but I think I would say look at where it's been legalised. Look what's happened. In some places it's not devastating. I mean, Oregon is not devastating, but it's going the wrong way. When I went to Oregon in 2004, it was looking relatively benign. Since then, the numbers have risen sharply, and they're rising year by year. Since then, we've had research showing that people who take their own lives were not necessarily mentally competent. Since then, we've seen the growth of doctor shopping. And then in the case of Holland, my word, and it is a Dutch bill that you've got before you now, that really is very serious. So I think I would say, look at where it's been tried and learn some lessons.
I would say I think the most dangerous thing of all is having two doctors, any two doctors, making a judgment over somebody's life, making them the gatekeeper, as well as expecting them to provide care. You either go in one direction or you go in another. How can you, as a clinician, be working hard to improve somebody's quality of life? And you may say, look, we'll try plan A for 48 hours. If that doesn't work, we'll go on to plan B. I've got plan C, and if that doesn't work, we'll find a plan D. That's quite a common conversation that I have with patients. You know, it's not just this, we've got other things, if you like, in the toolbox. But at the same time, we're booking for you to have your lethal drugs on Friday at 3 o'clock. You're going in two completely different directions at once. And having sat in on consultations with GPs in the Netherlands and having watched videos of consultations by GPs, I really think that you lose the ability to think creatively, to find solutions to individual problems, because you get caught up with having to fill in the forms and so on. You've got a limited resource, which is your time as a doctor with a lot of patients in front of you, and actually you have to decide, are you going to look after these patients and do what you can, or are you going to spend that time working through the processes and the forms? Because remember, if you spend that time doing that, you're taking time away from other bits of clinical care. And that's just the reality of there being a fixed number of hours in the day and a fixed resource of clinical staff. So I would say the most dangerous thing is leaving this in the hand of doctors. I'm saying doctors, I would say clinicians altogether. The pharmacist usually doesn't know you that well, but your local pharmacist actually may know a bit more about you socially, because you often chat when you're in the pharmacy. And chat to the other people in the shop, and they will have overheard conversations. They may actually know quite a lot about you, and you don't know it. The nurses, well, they change shifts and they're part of a team, and they may well, again, they'll only know what they see in front of them. Let me just give you one very quick anecdote. I had a patient, the family were desperate for us to do something more about her pain. And every time I went to her, she said, no, I don't need any more pain relief, I'm comfortable. Her birthday came, and it was a fairly muted birthday celebration, but you're not going to go, whoopee, let's put the balloons up, this is your last birthday, mum. So it was quiet. And after that, the family didn't visit much. And one of the nurses one night said she made her a hot chocolate and was sitting with her while she had it. And she said, it's a pity your family don't get in very much anymore. And the patient said, well, actually, my fixed-term life insurance policy expired on my birthday. And they've lost £11,000 because she'd outlived her expectation. Now, we were all taken in. We all thought this was a loving, caring, anxious family. I can see why they were anxious. They were wanting her to die before her birthday. But that's just the reality of human nature. And none of us, the nurses, nobody, remembered what was going on until afterwards, and she told us. And I've had other similar instances. Well, first of all, I don't think anybody should be left in agony. Okay, it is incumbent on those looking after them to do what they can. Yes, there are things which I think are agony. Burns, really bad burns. You've seen the fire, the Grenfell Tower fire that was on your news. It was actually just, I could see it from my daughter's back window, and she was called into the emergency room. Those fire victims were in, and still are, because they've got terrible burns. They're in agony. And that's a really difficult pain to control when you've got large-scale skin burns. People who've had some awful accidents, that pain can be difficult to control, but you keep on trying and you try to come out the other side. I don't know that the victims will be scarred, and there are all kinds of problems and difficulties they have to adapt to. I don't know whether they would fall within this criteria or not, and if they did, at what point would you say, yes, we give up on them? I don't know, but I think you really cannot accept a society that says, okay, we'll leave you in agony. No, as a medical professional, I think that that's absolutely terrible, and you must do everything in your power to get on top of distress. There's a huge international traffic in lethal drugs, I'm afraid. That's completely different to licensing somebody, your doctor, to be the judge as to whether or not he or she should supply you or administer lethal drugs to end your life. What this bill is doing is talking about licensing doctors to supply or give lethal drugs. That's what this bill is about. Just another thing about people dying. There's this view that somehow it's all out of your control. I've often been astonished how people stay alive for somebody coming from abroad. It's the other end of the flight for us, but you know, I had one man, he stayed alive for 6 weeks against all odds until his daughter arrived. She arrived from Heathrow and we are down in Cardiff. She was obviously exhausted, so we put a bed at the end of his bed in the ward and another bed next to his for his wife to lie in. So the 3 of them in a room. In the morning, 2 people woke up. He needed to see his daughter and that was it. And that has happened on so many occasions. People will wait for a family member to leave the room for the children to say goodbye. And the other thing that happens is sometimes people just need to be given permission to let go of life. It's okay. We can live without you. We can cope. You've prepared us for what lies ahead. And people just let go of life and die when they're ill and they're frail. That's their choice. But that's quite different to giving them lethal drugs and cutting off their life by months or years, which is what you're talking about here.